That's false. That whole dichotomy of either you're a Christian or you hold to science, but the two can't go together, that is a false meme.
Welcome to the Science and Faith podcast with Dr. James Tour. I'm Dr. James Tour, and I'll be your host. And you can find out my professional credentials at jmtour.com, or you could see more about my social media at drjamestour.org. That's drjamestour.org. And my producer for this podcast, as well as a lot of my newer videos, is Eric Heron, and he's with philosopherfilms.com. I'm a practicing scientist. I don't just talk about science. Most of my day is doing science. Most of my days, mornings, nights, it's doing science. And but I love Jesus more than anything else in the world. I just love Jesus, and I'm not afraid to say it, and I'll proclaim it, hopefully till the day I die, that I love Jesus more than anything else. And if you do not know about the resurrection, and if you do not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, and you'd like to know why this scientist believes in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, I would love to spend an hour with you. Now, this is not for believers. This is not for people that believe in the physical resurrection. This is for a person that does not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. I give you an invitation. Send me an email to tour, that's T-O-U-R, at drjamestour.org, tour at drjamestour.org, and I will respond to you, and we will get together for 1 hour. It might be less than an hour. It certainly doesn't take more than an hour. And I'll tell you about how I came to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, the evidence that I've seen, and why I believe in that. And I'd love to be able to tell you that story. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing our guest. And our guest today is Sy Garte. And Sy is has a PhD in biochemistry. And he's the author of the award-winning book, The Works of His Hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. And I have gone through this book and read this book, and it is a good book. And I'd suggest that you get this book. And a little bit more about Sy. He's been a tenured professor at New York University, Rutgers University, and the University of Pittsburgh. He's been the division director at the Center for Scientific Review at the National Institutes of Health, and the interim vice president for research at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. He's currently a visiting professor of pharmacology and toxicology at Rutgers University. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and he's written 5 books, as well as articles on science and Christian faith in periodicals such as Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith, More to Life, and Christianity Today. And he's been on numerous podcasts and YouTube channels. He's presently, Dr. Garte presently serves as editor-in-chief of the American Scientific Affiliation's, ASA's, online quarterly magazine, God and Nature, and also as vice president for the Washington, D.C. Metro chapter of the ASA. He's a member of the board of advisors for the John Templeton Foundation, and Dr. Garte became a Christian later in life and is now a certified lay servant of the United Methodist Church in Rockville, Maryland. So, welcome, Sy, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me here.
And my first question to you is, why do you, even as a scientist, why do you believe in something as amazing as the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Well, I didn't always. As you said, I came to faith later in life, in my middle age. But when I began, and we'll talk about this probably a bit more, when I began seeing the possibility of God, the possibility of theism being true, I began investigating the claims about Jesus Christ, and I found them amazingly convincing intellectually. I found that, all the eyewitness testimony that's recorded the rapid spread of Christian faith in those early days, and all the other testimony that we've heard from so many people and so many books was very convincing to me. But the real reason, the true reason that I absolutely am certain that Jesus Christ was who he said he was, is that I experienced him in my life. Jesus visited me in dreams and in other experiences, which are discussed in the book you mentioned. And at a certain point, it became undeniable. And as soon as that happened, and I confessed to myself out loud that I do believe, I am a believer, the transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. I had a sense of amazing joy, relief, understanding, and just, I don't know how to put it. It was transformative. And I've never gone back since then. And, you know, to me, there's no question. It's not something that needs to be thought about. There's no question that Jesus Christ was who he said he was. He's a part of the Trinity of God, and he's everything.
Well, there you go. And he's everything to me. I love to hear that. And I think that it's important for people to hear that you've published a lot of scientific articles, over 200 peer-reviewed articles. So you're a real scientist. You're not somebody who just talks about science. You actually do it, because there's a lot of people out there that talk about science, and that's great. I think it's great to have lots of people talking about science. But you are a practitioner of science, and you've been teaching biochemistry, and you've been talking about it. I want to go to your book, and I want to read different portions. And we're not following along the order of the book. I've taken out things that I just found interesting. And I want you to, I'll read this, and then you just expand upon it. So you wrote, while most of the material in this chapter played no transformational role in my faith journey, it could play such a role for some readers. Let me, before you expand on that, let me just pull out something else that you wrote. You wrote this: students who were on the verge of rejecting Christianity, who felt forced to choose between their faith and the science they were learning in college, have found a third way, a way to see that you can be a Christian and a scientist. Pastors struggling to keep their congregations aware, but not afraid of the blows from the secular society that use science as a weapon to create doubt, have come to see with renewed vigor the compatibility of Christian faith with the reality of science. Youth leaders, church lay leaders, and seminary students have seen the value of the evolutionary creationist message. Agnostics and people of spiritual yearning who had shunned Christianity because of fears of being trapped in an anti-scientific worldview have found in evolutionary creationism the path to allow the joy of God's grace to fill their souls without any sacrifice of their reason. So I read two portions, one short, one a little bit longer. Talk.
Okay. Let me start with the second one. The purpose there was to explain the reason that I wrote the book and who my target audience was. I have been dismayed, as I know you have been, whenever I hear of a student or a young person who grew up in Christian faith, which I didn't have the opportunity to do, and these students then say, well, you know, I believed in that until I got to school, till I got to college, and I learned science, and you know, I was told, and I see that science disproves all of that. The Bible is wrong. Jesus Christ could not possibly have risen, etc. And so now I've given up my faith, and this happened innumerable times, and it's still happening, as we know. And that group was my target audience. That's who I felt I was writing to. And my main message is exactly what you just read. That's false. That whole dichotomy of either you're a Christian or you hold to science, but the two can't go together. That is a false meme that is very prevalent in the world. I was at a meeting recently, not recently, but a short while ago, when it was just a open discussion in the community by scientists to explain science to the public. And there was a physicist speaking, and somebody asked a question, and the question had some theological overtones to it, and the physicist said something like, well, you know, I don't know why you're raising that. And the person asking the question said, well, I'm a Christian, but I'm also, you know, I also am a physicist. And the speaker said, really? That's amazing. And that was so disturbing to me because, you know, I have come to know thousands, literally thousands of scientists who are faithful Christians. The organization you mentioned, the American Scientific Affiliation, is an organization of Christians who work in science. Most of them are professors in geology, biology, chemistry, physics. And they're all Christians. And this idea that you can't be a scientist and have faith in God and follow Jesus is just false. And that's the message I want everyone to know.
And yes, I hear the same thing. I hear the same thing. And this is why I wanted you to pull this out, because young people need to hear this, that you can be a Christian walking closely with Jesus and be a scientist, and a very good scientist, publishing the top papers. These are not exclusive to one another. Right, absolutely. And I think we and many others are testimony to that. I mean, I know, in addition to yourself, I know quite a few very well-respected, very well-known scientists in their fields. I just mentioned Francis Collins, who is, you know, the head of the NIH, who are devout Christians, and I know several others. Nobel Prize winner, Bill Phillips, who is a Methodist and, you know, won the Nobel Prize in physics. So, you know, this is an important message to get across. And it could go even further than that, frankly, because, and this is something I don't know if we'll get into or not, but I've found recently that there's a lot of science denialism, not among Christians, but among atheists, because a lot of the science, the kind of science, in fact, that you and I are working on abiogenesis and the basic nature of life, many atheists are denying the basic scientific facts that have been accepted for decades, like the genetic code and the nature of the genetic code. And so I think what's happening is science is actually moving in a slightly theological direction. How much is hard to say, but it's getting very annoying to those atheists who think, and they're not scientists, they're the atheists who think that, you know, science is the antidote to religion. It's the word they often use. In fact, it's just the opposite. It may become clear soon that science is actually a buttress to Christian faith, and it's the atheists who are going to turn out to be the ones, I believe, who are anti-science. Yeah, well, we're going to get into that more. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Let me go back to this other short statement. While most of the material in this chapter played no transformational role in my faith journey, it could play such a part for some readers. And I came to the Lord at the age of 18. I had just turned 18, and when I heard the gospel, a few months after that, I came to the Lord. And it was not a scientific thing that drew me in. I was an experience with Jesus Christ when I asked him into my life and asked him to forgive me. So, you know, some people get this impression that, you know, as I studied science, I saw something in it can be that way. Most people that I know, it came more through the heart than through the head. And I think that that's what you're suggesting, but you're also just suggesting that through the head, people are getting drawn astray. So carry along that thought for me.
Yeah, I agree completely with what you said, Jim. And I think the way I would put it is, and what happened with me was that what I learned in science turned me away from the dogma that I had previously learned. the dogma was that everything is materialistic, everything is reductionist, naturalism can explain everything easily. And what I learned in science turned me away from that and broke down that resistance that I had to even think about the possibility of God. And that's important, because there are many people who suffer the same way, as you just said, who just think, well, okay, no, I may have had a good experience, or maybe somebody brought me to church and I was impressed, but science tells me no, it's impossible. And that's what has to be broken down first. I had experiences with the Holy Spirit my whole life, the most impressive one when I was 16, and I just ignored them, or I just literally said to myself, no, that can't be true, that can't be real. They were real, but I wouldn't accept it because of this wall that I had built against the possibility of believing in God. And when I began learning about, modern physics and modern biology, I saw, wait a minute, that's not correct, what I had thought. It's not true that science gives us a purely materialistic worldview. There's a lot of things in modern physics that sort of shape that idea. So that was helpful to me. But you're right, it did not bring me to faith. What brought me to faith was intervention, direct intervention by the Holy Spirit. I mean, the way I sometimes put it is, he grabbed me and he pushed me across the threshold, and I had no choice. Once I was past that threshold, it was clear that, the truth was the truth.
And I saw a close friend of mine, Rick Smalley, the discoverer, one of the 3 discoverers of C60, buckyball, and really the one who ushered in, a real push in nanotechnology. I saw Rick go from being quite antagonistic to coming to the Lord. And many people think it came through the head. No, for Rick, it came right through his heart. Something touched him in his heart. And then, he started thinking more about this in deeper terms. So yeah, this is a constant pattern. Okay, so and let me also continue along this thought that God often touches the heart. We get drawn astray very often by pullings from the mind. But this whole idea that science is now bumping up against what was formerly called the metaphysical. We see this, for example, in NDE, near-death experience, where people who die for 5 minutes and they flatline for 5 minutes. And this happens now. I listened to a presentation by somebody who'd interviewed hundreds of people who've gone through near-death experiences, and it's across the board, different religions, atheists, Christians, Hindus, and there's some common features, there's uncommon features, but mysterious things happen. People see themselves raising up out of their bodies. You say, well, this is their imagination. Well, they describe things on the tops of shelves that were in the hospital room that they could not have seen when they were lying down on a gurney. Then they describe going up, and they describe things that are on the roof of the hospital that they could never have seen. And then they check it out. Yes, these exact things are on the roof. There's things that happen that scientists have no explanation for. And so really science is really bumping up against things that it really cannot explain. And we're going to get into this more through some statements in your book, but I think you'd agree with this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot that we're discovering in every branch of science that makes you scratch your head, at least, or makes you wonder, well, that we're missing something here. It's not all easily explained, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yes, and let me just tell the audience here, because it didn't come out in that very short vignette that you gave us about your testimony, is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, he's a Jew, but his parents were communists, which is not that uncommon for people that were kind of grew up in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, that you had the intellectual class that kind of thought communism was going to be this big savior of everything. And he grew up in a home like that. And he's not speaking from a young man that grew up in a Christian home. It was actually just the opposite.
Yeah, my family were atheists and communists going back 3 generations. My grandparents were atheists and communists, all 4 of them, and so were my parents, and so were all my uncles and great uncles and everyone else. And that's how I grew up. So I was taught that, Comrade Stalin was the greatest man who ever lived, and Christianity was the worst evil that had ever appeared on earth. All religion was bad. I never had any I didn't even know I was Jewish, frankly, the first few years of my life. I never went to Hebrew school, did no holidays at all. We gave presents on New Year's Day because that's what they did in the Soviet Union. They gave presents to kids on New Year's Day. So that's when I got my presents. So yeah, I was about as extreme as you could get, and I absorbed all of that and remained an atheist, a very strong atheist. Through my 30s, I dropped the communism part much earlier, but the atheism lasted longer, and it's very hard to break out of a dogma like that. That dogma that I learned was just from early childhood was very difficult to break out of, and that's one of the things that contributed to my wall of resistance.
Yes. So let me read a couple of more statements and then talk about this. You wrote in your book, life was designed by the Creator. It is divine design, not intelligent design. And the mechanism by which life was designed and created are not currently within our ability to understand. Right. I prefer to characterize what we see behind the creation of the universe and of life on this planet as divine design, not intelligent design.
Right. Yeah, I take exception with the term of intelligent design because it implies that God is intelligent. I think God is way beyond intelligent. I know a lot of intelligent people, as do you, and God is not an intelligent, person. God is way ahead of that. And intelligent design itself, I think, has some very interesting ideas. I'm not completely opposed to it. I think some of their ideas are good, especially related to the origin of life. But my problem with intelligent design is the lack of a positive scientific explanation. So for me, it's not enough simply to attack evolution, although I will say that there are parts of evolutionary theory that are difficult and, may need to be changed and may need to be, revised. But you have to do more than that. You have to actually propose an agenda. And I think that's important. And I call it divine design because that implies that we may never understand how life came to be and how life is the way it is, because we can never understand the mind of God. And if that's the case, and I don't know if it is or not, but I have a feeling it might be, then I think divine design is the right term, because God designed our life, the origin and the evolution of life, to result in us in a way that may be beyond our human understanding, and even understanding ourselves, human consciousness. Look what we're doing right now. I mean, how many chimps have done a podcast recently? It's not something any other animal could do or could dream of doing or would have an understanding of. We're something different. And of course, that goes along with being made, especially in the image of God, as the Bible says. And that image of God gives us an ability to know that God exists, to worship God. But it doesn't allow us to look that closely into the mind of God. There are still many mysteries we don't know about how God created and what his intentions were. And so I like to call it divine design and then explore it as much as we can. And I think that's worth doing.
Good. This statement that you wrote, this paragraph that I'm about to read, fits right into these things that you were saying, the things that we don't know. You say, you wrote, in short, I had reached the point where my certainty that there was nothing in the universe that could not be scientifically described was gone. Many of the arguments against theism seemed no longer valid. I now find it interesting that even though this became clear to me while I was still an atheist, I didn't believe in God, many anti-theists, those who believe theism is irrational or evil, continue to use those same tired arguments. They claim that belief in a deity is irrational, for example, or that miracles defy science. These claims cannot possibly hold water when science itself tells us that the universe is not rational and that much stranger things than miracles are everyday occurrences. Wow, you got to tell us about this.
Okay, right. So, yeah, there's a lot in there. But I think the bottom line is this describes what I mentioned before is the breaking down of my resistance to the idea of God, to the idea of anything supernatural or miraculous or spiritual. And, at one point I was still, I think, an atheist or maybe becoming an agnostic. I wrote a little essay about mysticism, in fact, Jewish mysticism, in fact, because I had just been reading a book about Jewish mysticism. And as I read it, it sounded very familiar. And then I began reading some works on the I guess the Tao of physics was one book I read, which was about how quantum mechanics implies some aspect of spirituality that might exist. And I put the two together and I said, you can write a paragraph where the key person is a mystic, and then you can change mystic to scientist and you have the same paragraph. Because what they're looking at is the deep reality of the world. And in one case we call it physics, and in the other we may call it metaphysics. But the words describing the experience and the methodology to some extent and the ways of thinking are not that different. And that struck me as sort of a revelation. Now, I had not yet become a believer when I wrote that, but it made me think, maybe all of this anti-mysticism, anti-spirituality, which I had learned as a child, was just completely wrong. And, the whole idea of the uncertainty principle of, wave functions collapsing, the observer effect, these things are not part of a reductionist, materialistic universe. These are things that we don't understand philosophically. We can't really grasp them. And I recently read something by the physicist Sean Carroll, who's a pretty strong atheist, who said that, the way physics students learn this is they see something that's kind of strange, and like the Schrodinger equation with its wave function, and they're told, shut up and calculate. And that's all we have to do. Don't think about what this all means, what it means that, in fact, reality is based on probability. There's a probability that the electron is here rather than here. It's not here, and it's not there. There's a probability that it's in these places. And that, even Einstein didn't like that, but it's true. I mean, it's real fact. And what are the implications of that? So that's what I started thinking about. And when I said that the universe is not rational, what I meant was rational the way we used to think of rational. So if we went back to the heyday of physical science, let's say in the very late 19th century, when people were still thought they had really figured everything out, there was not much else left to do in scientific research except a few decimal points. And the only problem they had was this issue of the speed of light. You know, they couldn't understand how the speed of light could be constant. And if we went back there and told them, well, you know what, guys, it turns out the speed of light is constant because time is not constant. Time gets slower and faster. And then we told them, you know, the electron is not in any particular place until you actually measure it, and then it's in a place. They would have said to us, well, you're crazy. That's completely irrational. That's nonsense. And the fact is this: science does not stay constant. Even the methods of science are not constant. They change. Okay, so the quantum mechanic people had to use different mathematics, you know, with all these operators and Lagrangians and all these mathematics that were new. And then they were able to make progress. And I believe that's exactly the case for biology and biochemistry. We've gotten to a point where we can't really go much further in understanding the basic fundamental principles of life, like how it began, unless we expand our scientific methodology and our scientific paradigm to include things that so far have been forbidden.
Well, I really resonate with this, that the universe is not rational, and much stranger things than miracles are everyday occurrences. So
Right.
when I hear, for example, people talk about the origin of the universe, from a point, everything happened from nothing, all of this happened, and there was a big burst and all of this, and everything started shooting out from this one point. That kind of sounds like a miracle to me.
Yeah.
This is a really astounding miracle. And people will now speak of this as, oh, this is well known, this is well accepted.
Yeah.
And then, but nothing else miraculous. But Jesus rising from the dead, no, that could never happen. but all of this from nothing, no problem, no problem. Now, let me touch on something else. So, you know, I think that it is harder for me to grasp evolutionary theory than it is for you, because you are a biologist and I'm an organic chemist. And I just know how hard it is to get molecules to do things. And my experience is biologists have been using something that is so amazing, biological chemistry, and they're used to just mixing things and seeing amazing things happen. Whereas as a synthetic chemist, I look at that and I say, this is extraordinary that biology can do this. This is extraordinary. Try to get molecules to do this type of thing. I mean, we haven't the foggiest idea how it could do this. And so then when I start probing evolutionists for more details, they start telling me stories. I say, tell me more. How did you come to that conclusion? How does that happen? And then they start to tell me a story. And they tell me some grand story. And then I say, well, that can't be right because of such and such. They go, well, okay. Well, what it could have done is this. And then it's a different story. And it's all accepted. Now, what you do is you kind of play with this idea of storytelling. And so I'm going to read a paragraph that you wrote, and you were being facetious. So I just want to alert the viewers that you're being facetious when you write this. And you know, this is typical professor play. I mean, you professors do this type of thing. But here's what you wrote. Take, for example, the well-known human tendency to bite one's fingernails when nervous. We could say that long fingernails presented an impediment to the manual dexterity needed to properly wield a weapon. And therefore, when nervous, human tends to be sure that his or her fingernails are as short as possible. This is complete nonsense that I just made up without any more than a moment's thought about it, but that it sounded good. In other words, this is the kind of talk that I hear from evolutionists. And so you say, why do Why do humans bite their fingernails? They bite their fingernails because you had to yield a weapon and you wanted your fingernails to be short so they didn't get in the way. And so this is why humans do that. I'm telling you, Sy, this is the type of thing that I get from evolutionists. And as a physical scientist, as a chemist, it's very hard for me to grasp it. And I even ask students sometimes when they're at giving a presentation, say, how does that happen? They'll show something amazing that happens in the biological world. How does that happen? And they go, well, all this came about evolutionarily. And because they said evolutionarily, I'm supposed to go, oh, I see, I bow down to evolution. Now I understand. Once you say evolution, I've got to accept it. And the student doesn't realize that they don't know anything about this. And you can't just throw out that term evolutionarily and have it accepted. So based on what you wrote, based on my experience, help me out here.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really glad you brought this up. I am an evolutionary creationist, which means I believe that God used evolution to create the diversity of life we see. But what I'm always trying to do on YouTube, online, everywhere, including in the book and things I write, is explain to people that evolution explains some things and not others. Here's what it can explain. It can explain, obviously, microevolution. Everybody agrees with that. Even young Earth creationists do. It can explain speciation in a way that's sort of an extension of microevolution. But the most important thing is what it does not explain. It does not explain anything about what happened before the arrival of the last common universal ancestor, LUCA, Luca. And Luca, we know this because every cell that now exists has the same properties of Luca. That's why it's called the last universal ancestor. But Luca was an amazingly complex organism. It had a genetic code, the genetic code. It had DNA. It had a protein synthesis machinery that is unimaginable. No human could ever come up with such an incredibly complex design. It had, it had energy conversion systems. It had photosynthesis. It had all kinds of metabolic pathways. It was full of enzymes, which are incredible catalysts. I don't have to tell you about catalysts. Incredible catalysts, unseen in the non-living world, with specificity and efficiency, thousands of times beyond anything else. All of that was already present. How did it get there? We don't know. It's very simple. We don't know. And you've been saying this for a long time. So I'm talking about after we have all the molecules, which you often talk about, after we have RNA, after we have peptides, after we have nucleotides, even after all that, how it all gets put together in these complex systems and you have a living cell, we don't know. So evolution doesn't cover that because all of those systems are required for evolution to work. And here's a very important point. When you talk to evolutionists or anybody else, what is evolution? They will tell you it's variation followed by natural selection. They've left out a key step. There's a third step that's just as important as those two, and that is accurate self-replication. You don't get evolution unless a cell can make two almost identical copies of itself. How does it do that? There is nothing in the natural world that self-replicates. No chemical, right? No structure. I'm talking about accurate to 99.9999% accuracy. If you see a house that you like and you want to make a replica of that, you could do it, but it would be very difficult. There's no house that makes a copy of itself. There's nothing that makes a copy of itself. And cells are far more complex than houses or anything else we know about. So you have to have that. And how do you get that? You can't evolve it because you have to have self-replication for evolution to even start. So everyone leaves out that step. And that's what I'm actually working on now in a theoretical biological way. And I published one paper and I have another one in press, which we can talk about later. But the other thing about this, the other part that evolution does not explain is us, human beings. Yeah, we very likely, our bodies very likely, they're private, we're primates. We very likely evolved physically from some primate, common ancestor of chimps, gorillas, us, etc. But that tells us nothing about who we are, why we do what we do. Why are we creative? Why can we do art? Why do we make jokes? Why do we do science? Why are we interested in the world? Why do we worship God? Where does all that come from? It doesn't come from evolution. Evolution has nothing to say about this. Nothing. And what I was saying in that paragraph, it was a satire on what's called evolutionary psychology, which is I consider, really pseudo-scientific attempt to explain everything in life, including everything in human life, through evolution. Can't be done. And why not? Because evolution is a very clear, specific scientific theory, and it's defined as a change in allele frequency in a population with time. So allele frequencies, that means you have to look at genes, okay? Alleles, for those listening who are not aware, alleles are forms of genes, and when you get a mutation, you get a new allele. So those alleles can change in frequency because of natural selection with time in a population. That's a very clear mathematical, scientific definition, and nothing in evolutionary psychology, they never identify a gene, they never identify an allele, they never show that a particular gene has a particular behavior. They just say, well, okay, let's say, people were good to each other because if they were good to each other, then the other person was good to them, and so that helped their chances. What? There's no science here. Zero. There's no gene. There's no evidence. Nothing. So my point is that when we get to humans, evolution is done. And in fact, even Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, has said, human beings are past evolution. We've only had a few mutations in the human population since, we diverged from other primates. One of those is that now many of us, not all of us, but many of us can drink milk as adults. That's a big mutation. We have changes in skin color. We have a few other changes that have occurred, in evolutionary time, which is hundreds of thousands of years. Otherwise, we're exactly the same genetically as we always were. And yet, do we live the same way? No, we don't. We don't even live the same way we lived, 10 years ago. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out how these computers work. And why is that? That's because of cultural evolution. Cultural evolution has nothing to do with biology. It's a product, it's something that happens with human beings because of our brains, not our genes. And why are our brains the way they are? Because we're made in the image of God. This is a gift from God, that we have these brains, that we have this consciousness, that we have our souls. This is not science, this is theology.
Good. I'm glad that these statements that some evolutionists will make bother you as much as they bother me.
Terribly.
Yeah.
I can tell you one more very funny story, if I may, on this.
Go ahead.
I recently
read
that a paper was published. I don't know the journal. It was some pseudo social science journal, I guess, which said they had an explanation for why girls prefer pink and boys don't. Boys like blue. And the explanation was that way back at the beginning of humanity, the women were often the ones who collected berries and other fruits. And since berries are red, girls like the idea of red and pink. And, and that's a theory that was published. Well, somebody wrote a response to that saying, you know what? First of all, the premise is false. Girls don't prefer pink. Even 100 years ago in Western Europe, pink was considered a masculine color. And in China today, pink is considered a masculine color. So the whole idea is wrong. So they're coming up with a just so story to explain something that isn't even true. I mean, this is not science.
Right, that's not science. I want to continue a little bit along this thought. You've been you said you watched some of the series that I did on origin of life in response to a young man that calls himself Professor Dave.
Indeed.
And he came with another response to what I had done, and you were telling me how hard it was for you to listen to that because of the nonsense that was thrown out there. So I'm not the only scientist that has trouble listening to this stuff. Putting aside the personal attacks, just the science, the way he described it is so ridiculous. But here, you might want to comment on that. You can, or if you want to. But here's what a paragraph that you wrote in your book. Glib pronouncements of evolutionary mechanisms for explaining all aspects of human nature, along with the claim that science has found that human beings are nowhere as special as we like to think, are not scientific but philosophical statements. Other pseudo-scientific claims that have become popular is that DNA is not a code, that we understand how a universe can spontaneously arise from nothing, and that the origin of life is now almost completely understood and explained by chemical evolution. None of these are true. Theologians, pastors, and Christian lay people should be advised that they might not be dealing with legitimate science every time they hear somebody, scientist or not, claim that science says something. And they should be cautious about trying to incorporate such philosophical views into Christian theological thinking.
Right.
Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, this is a pet peeve of mine, and people like the person you mentioned, are people who propagate this mythology, and I think it's unfortunate because people like him and others are not actually scientists. They watched a lot of videos on YouTube. They've maybe read a few papers or books, but they haven't done any research of their own. They don't know what science is. They don't know what it involves. One of the main things they don't understand is the tremendous care and caution that every working scientist employs. I don't have to tell you, I'm telling the audience that when we do an experiment, whatever that experiment may be, we have to be so careful in how we do it and in how we interpret it. And the last thing we want to do is jump to a conclusion and say, we've discovered something, here it is. No, you have to repeat that experiment many, many times, and you have to make sure other people can repeat it also. I have published papers that turned out to be wrong. One in particular where I found something, it was very striking. It had to do with a genetic variant that might have been, that we thought led to an increased susceptibility to lung cancer. And the data looked good, and we published it. It's one of the mistakes that I made in my career. There was nothing wrong with it. The problem is our sample size was too small. And so the statistics that we did were not really very good. And two other people tried to repeat it. They didn't get it. And we tried to repeat it also. And we found out that, in fact, we were wrong. You want to avoid that because that doesn't look good in your reputation if you have too many incidents like that. So we are extremely cautious. We're extremely careful. Both in our scientific work and when we talk about things. So to say that we've discovered something, that we're almost there, we've almost got it, it's just a few more steps and we'll be there, that's very few scientists speak that way. If anything, they're going to be very careful and say, we have found something that is consistent with the possibility that such and such might or maybe not be true. I mean, that's about as strong as you get. And when you hear somebody like the individual you mentioned, Dave, say, oh yeah, we know that, that chirality is easy. That's not a problem. All of these statements of certainty of, oh, I absolutely know what's going on, then you know you're not listening to a scientist. You're listening to someone who, studied a little science at some point in their life, but they're not a scientist. And, this is why I think it's important for people to understand that when scientists come to faith, especially in cases like us and many others where they weren't originally believing people, but came to faith, you can bet that it took a lot to get them there, okay? That they had to overcome their resistance, their reluctance to jump to a conclusion before all the data's in. And I am very happy to say that I have no sense that I jumped to any conclusions when I accepted Jesus Christ as Savior. Mm-hmm. I looked at all the data, and it's all consistent, and mm-hmm.
And here, so yeah. I mean, this is, you're right. We have to be very careful what we say and what we write. I've even been interviewed sometimes by Christian leaders, and I'm not saying quite what they want me to say, and they'd say, "Can you just say on camera this, this, and this, and we'll record you saying that?" I said, "No, I can't say that. I can't say that."
Right.
And they don't understand why I can't say it. I said, you can say it. As a pastor, you can say it. Right. But I can't say it because I don't know. I don't know that to be true. I know certain things to be true, but I know other things I don't know. I want to read something else. You were talking about knowledge and how there's this idea sometimes that only scientists, science has the knowledge. And you wrote this. You wrote, "I once met a professor of English who specialized in 15th century poetry and was a respected scholar in his field. He had a great deal of knowledge about things that most scientists would not even be interested in, but it was knowledge. The denial of any knowledge other than the scientific kind gives us a distorted view of reality. By insisting on scientism, we are not only harming non-scientific scholarship, we are also harming science because we are encouraging a misleading understanding of it that can only lead to eventual disillusionment and even abandonment of science as an activity important for humans."
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, scientism, I think, is the enemy of science. It's the enemy of faith. It's the enemy of everything because it's just a false doctrine. It's completely false. I would even call it satanic if I were inclined to use that term. It's a lie. It's a big, huge lie. And of course, what scientism is the belief, the philosophical belief, that all truth can only come from scientific proof. And of course, the nonsense of there is that we don't even look at proof. I mean, science does not do proof. We do evidence, we do, consensus, we do, this is very likely true. We don't talk about proof. I once challenged someone, find me a paper in science that uses the word proof. And he came up with one, but in fact, it was a mathematical paper. And so, you have proofs in math, you have proofs in logic, but not in science. So whenever these atheists say to me, prove you're God, I just ignore it. I mean, there's no reason to answer them because they don't know what they're talking about. And scientism is dangerous because of what I said. It leads people who hear about it, who hear people say that the only issues are scientific, that are real. Well, they're leaving out, everything else. They're leaving out love. They're leaving out politics. They're leaving out history. They're leaving out, social interactions and so many things that are so important to the way we live. So I think it's a dangerous and really evil doctrine that has spread and taken over. It's been disproved many times over many different, historical periods. And I'll tell you something interesting. The first person who told me that science cannot prove everything, cannot even address all questions, was my atheist father, who himself was a physical chemist. And he said to me, there are questions that science can't address.
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out in your book, you talk about pi,
right.
3.141592, that and these other constants, Planck's constant, for
Right.
example, the speed of light, that constant,
right.
that these are constants, but they're there,
Yeah.
but we don't understand their origin.
Right. We can never, and in fact, when I asked this question, in fact, this may have been what sparked my father's response. I said, I think it was Avogadro's number, which, is so important in chemistry. And I said, why is Avogadro's number that? What, 6.23 something?
6.023.
Yeah, okay. And he said, that's a question that science doesn't answer. We don't ask it. We don't even ask. Is anybody doing research on why Avogadro's number is that number? No, there's no way to find out. You use the numbers and the constants to, make other discoveries, to come up with laws, to make predictions. But why is it that number? Why is pi what it is? Why is it irrational? Why is it, all of these questions. These are scientific questions that cannot be answered by science. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And think of all the other questions which cannot be answered by science.
Right. Let me follow along with that. You talk a little bit about a simulated universe, and so I like your writing because you poke people and you try to elicit a reaction. So you say, according to simulation hypotheses, we are characters in a much more advanced analogy of a computer game, something akin to the fictional world of the film The Matrix. As the argument goes, if we lesser mortals can simulate reality at some level, then some putative, highly intelligent aliens might have already become incredibly good at simulations, and we could very well be living in one of their projects. Apparently, this hypothesis is being taken seriously by some scientists. My question is, if you are going to talk about simulators, those who made the simulations, how exactly is that different from talking about a creator? Why is the idea of simulated universe acceptable for scientific discussion, while the idea of a universe created and maintained by God is not?
Right. I was watching a discussion hosted by
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And several very good scientists on there. Tyson himself is an atheist and or an agnostic atheist, I'm not sure, but he has indicated his unwillingness to accept the idea of a God. And I think everyone else on the panel, possibly with one exception, were atheists. And they were seriously talking about this hypothesis of simulated universe. And, I guess somewhere else I wrote, maybe it's in the book, I don't remember, but I wrote that, we have the choice between a loving creator who came to earth to set us straight, to save our souls, Jesus Christ, versus some, alien teenager in his mother's basement who's making fake universes. I think I'll go with Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that they will talk about these sorts of things, and
Incredible.
It's totally acceptable.
Yeah.
But should you mention God and especially God of the Bible? No.
No.
Yeah.
I know. It's crazy. It's just amazing.
You talk a little bit about when you first became a believer. You said, when I first became aware that I was a believer, I wondered what effect it would have on my scientific worldview. I was quite delighted to find that, if anything, my scientific worldview was strengthened. Worship of God has led me to want to probe deeper into the truth about the universe. Faith in God is a wonderful asset to a scientist who strives to understand the meaning behind the laws of physics and biology that rule our universe.
Yeah, I didn't know when I came to faith, which is described in chapter 9, the way that happened. I knew that I was a believer. I couldn't go back, but I was worried because I did not know at that time any other Christians who were scientists. It turns out that I did, but I didn't know that they were Christians. They were not open about it. They were being quiet, like I remained for some time. And I think the first time I knew there was another Christian who was a scientist was when I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And, you know, and as I said once, now I knew there were two of us. But then I found out that there are many, many. And I also found out that, you know, it's not necessary to give up the idea of evolution. It's not necessary to give up anything in your scientific worldview. What you do is you find out why you're studying science, which is the same reason that the original scientists became scientists, you know, back in with Newton and Galileo and Copernicus and, oh my goodness, Boyle and Pasteur and Faraday and Maxwell, all of whom were devout Christians, okay, and basically were investigating the laws, the reality of physical nature to understand God, to understand God's creation, to understand the book of nature, the book of His works, which is actually the title of my blog. But that's the book of works is God's revelation to us through nature, and it relates to that famous passage in Scripture. You know, I can't say it by heart because I'm very bad at that. But you know, we know God from what we see, from the works, His works that we see, and we're without excuse because it's all here. I mean, just look around, and there's the evidence for God. And so that's why I say that with a belief in God, you know why you're doing what you're doing. You know what you're looking for. You're looking to understand God's creation, and it helps with worship, and it helps just with, you know, being a good scientist, of being honest and faithful and true. And for me, it was thrilling to come to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And you follow along this thought on the same page. You say there's this erroneous idea that while scientists are always open-minded and searching for new ways to see truth, people of faith think they have it all figured out. They believe they know the final truth, the dogma that cannot change. In reality, open-minded people are open-minded about science and faith, and closed-minded people are dogmatic about both. Yeah.
And that's been my experience, and I'm sure yours as well. We all know scientists who cannot change their minds, right? I mean, they have a theory that they stick to in the face of all opposition, and we all know religious people. I got to tell you, one of the things that always amuses me is when atheists come up with one argument, which is, well, if God is real, why are there so many different denominations? And in the next breath, they say, well, this whole question of why is there rigidity, okay? So the next breath, they'll say, oh, but Christians are so dogmatic, they all have to believe one thing. Well, if they all have to believe one thing and are dogmatic, then how can you be complaining about all the different denominations? The reason there are so many different denominations is because Christians are open-minded, and Christianity changes and has been changing and always changes. So yeah, that's complete nonsense. And I think that, you know, it's important to be open-minded. It's important to seek the truth, and we can seek it through science. We can seek it through philosophy. We can seek it through any way we want. But be open and be honest about what you find.
Right, and I think this is another thing. So what you do in this book is you keep grabbing at things that people think are tremendous ideas, and you blow them apart. And so you say another way to look at this issue relates to the problem of consciousness, as discussed in chapter 6. If consciousness is an illusion, a quote, nothing but, unquote, the meaningless firing of certain neural circuits, as would be the case if pure naturalism were true, then human reason, a product of that illusory consciousness, would itself be illusory.
Right.
And it would be impossible for humans to actually know anything to be true based on reason. which of course would be a product of that illusory consciousness.
Yeah, I stole that idea from Alvin Plantinga, I think. He has made a very strong case of this, and I think, I don't remember if I cited him or not, but if not, it was a mistake because I got it from him, from something he wrote. But yeah, I mean, this relates to the self-contradictory nature of true philosophical atheism, if you, or naturalism, pure naturalism. It's very hard for a human being with the brain that we have, with the mind that we have, with the way that we can think, to claim that everything is, just is nothing but, that famous nothing buttery phrase, is nothing but molecules in motion and energy and, the basic principles of chemistry and physics. If you claim that, how can you trust anything? Right. Where does that all come from? And the answer is very, very clear. This is why theism makes so much sense. The answer is, yeah, we have a good mind that can do all this stuff and it has neurons, but we also have a soul. And it's the soul that allows us to think these thoughts and feel these feelings and have these emotions and understand what the world is all about. Right.
Some people are going to be upset that I even gave you time on this podcast because you, like Joshua Swamidas, are an evolutionist, and that bothers people. And so let me read something, and let me just say, look, evolutionists can love God just as you do, Sy. They love God, and as far as I can tell from the scriptures, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that he has risen from the dead, you will be saved. Romans 10:9. I mean, this is it. And this is the key. You don't have to believe even in Adam and Eve. If that were essential, that would have been in that verse. We are told what is the essential. It is the confession that Jesus is Lord and the believing in our heart that he has risen from the dead, and we will be saved. There are lots of ways that people think other things. Some people will say, well, if you grab in onto evolutionary theory, you discount the Genesis account. And as you quite nicely put in your book, look, we look at scientific things, we look in the things of the Bible, and we can misinterpret things all the time. We do it in science all the time. I mean, I've misinterpreted things in science. I've published a lot of papers, and you misinterpret things, and you publish another paper, and you correct things. You do that with theology all the time. I mean, sometimes I can teach something and go out of the class and think, that was all wrong. I mean, I'm talking about a Bible class.
Right.
And so these are hard things. Right. You may get these things wrong, or things that I've taught. I read great theologians and they show me that, that wasn't right what I was thinking. So we can misinterpret things all the time. The key for salvation is Jesus Christ is Lord and he has risen from the dead.
Amen.
I want to give you just a few minutes to talk a little bit about this, because this is important, because this is you spend time in your book talking about this, and I think you do a good job, and you don't try to get too deep for people, but you talk about why you believe that evolutionary theory is the right way. And you say this: many atheistic evolutionists acknowledge that evolution has a direction and stop there. But what or who directs it? An atheist can argue that no director is needed other than natural selection. For me, evolution makes God's providence in the biological world apparent. I believe that the direction of evolution toward greater complexity, including multicellularity, efficient energy conversion, and the vertebrate body plan, the development of neural circuitry, and the emergence of brains, all have a purpose determined by God's will. In ways that we cannot understand, it is God's providence that exercises that will on the biological world, much as his providence answers our prayers and allowed the miracles of his own incarnation and the resurrection on earth. Providential evolution should reassure both the Christian believer and the agnostic that evolution is not only consistent with, but is also a fundamental part of God's work. God granted humans a soul, and we are created in His image. But the soul must inhabit a body, and the human body was created by God using providential evolution. So I want to give you a chance to just run with that for a while.
Right. So, what my feelings about evolution are, they're actually somewhat changing a little bit with time, but basically the bottom line I would say is what I said before, that I think of evolution as a scientific theory which has a huge amount of evidentiary support from genetics, geology, paleontology, fossil records, etc. There are a lot of holes, and evolutionary theory is not finished. The old neo-Darwinian theory is pretty much out the window, and there's a lot of new developments in evolutionary theory. Sometimes they're called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And some of these new developments are very interesting because they kind of point to something beyond pure naturalism. Now, I can't go into detail because it gets pretty complicated, but what I think is true, and this is going to be very controversial, and I'm not sure anyone has said this publicly before, I think it's time for Christians to stop talking about evolution. It doesn't matter. And here's why I say this. If you look at young earth creationists, people from ID, Stephen Meyer, for example, who I recently had a very brief exchange with and very satisfying, people at BioLogos who are evolutionary creationists, there's very little argument actually going on. Nobody's saying that the basic principles of evolution are wrong. If you look at Ken Ham and Anthos and Genesis, the Creation Museum, they're talking about evolution. They're talking about the creation of kinds, which are up at the order level, and then, let's say, a cat kind, and a dog kind, and a bear kind, and the cat kind then evolved after the flood into lions, tigers, pussycats, jaguars, all the different kinds of cats we now know today. And the mechanism of that evolution, which had to be very fast, but still, was mutation, variation, genetic variation, and natural selection. Exactly the same mechanism that evolutionists, as you call them, believe. So we're talking about young earth creation saying, well, we go along with this kind of evolution. And of course, everyone, as I said before, agrees that microevolution is real, that a species continually evolves and improves itself. So all you have to do to get everyone to agree completely is to demonstrate that macroevolution is actually microevolution, but on a different scale. And now that doesn't solve everything, because there's still open questions like how do we get multicellularity? How do we get body plans? And there's a lot to do. Evolution is not finished, but it's a good theory. And the fact is, it's not an atheistic theory at all. It's a theory. It's a theory of science. It's like the theory of gravity. I mean, nobody talks about, is gravity real or is it just a theory? Nobody says that, is the theory of gravity wrong because the Bible talks about God, making sparrows fall down. No, gravity is accepted as a fact, as much of a scientific fact as anything else. And we have a law for gravity, and we have another law for gravity. We have general relativity. Evolution is heading in the same way. What is really important, I think, theologically, is not how animals evolve from each other, but those two areas that I mentioned are not covered by evolution. The beginning of life, from nothing, from chemicals in small warm ponds, okay, to Luca, to the first living cell. That is not covered by evolution, and that's where we need to focus. And the second part is us. how did we get the way we are? How did we have obvious souls? How do we have, these mental capacities that don't exist anywhere else? How do we have, altruism? How do we have love? Why do we love? You don't need love for survival. I mean, some people would say better if you don't love. It's pain. Love can be painful, but we have it. We do it. Why do we laugh? Why do we have humor? Why do we paint pictures? Where does all this come from? It has nothing to do with evolution. So at the beginning and at the end, those are the two areas that to me are where we should be devoting our efforts. To attack evolution and to defend evolution, I think, is becoming silly. It's not going anywhere. If you say evolution is not biblical because it doesn't agree with Genesis, what you said is absolutely right. We don't know exactly what Genesis is saying. Can anyone tell me that they can really understand Genesis and what it means? I don't think so, because if you do, then you've got a lot of problems, like, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and all the problems in Genesis 2 and 3. So these are, I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. I think the Bible has nothing wrong in it. It's all correct. But saying that does not mean we can understand it and interpret it properly. And what I think is, there's only one truth. It's God's truth. And we get to it from two different ways. We get to it from his book of words, from the Bible, and we get to it from science, the book of works. And when they don't agree, which is often, we're getting one or both of them wrong. And sometimes, for example, for up until our lifetime, it was believed that the universe was steady state. Past eternal, always been here, no beginning. That was the scientific view. And now we know that, well, it turns out Genesis was right, science was wrong. Okay? We now know that the universe had a beginning 14 billion years ago, but it was a beginning. So sometimes we'll find out that, we misinterpreted the science, and other times we'll find out we misinterpreted Genesis. But to say that because of what we now know scientifically and what we now think we know about interpreting the Bible is the truth, the absolute final truth, there's nothing more to do, that's ridiculous. We're going to learn a lot more science as time goes by, and we're going to have a lot more insights into the Bible. And my belief is that when we do that, we're going to see the two truths coming closer and closer together. I don't know if we'll ever get to the final answer, but they're going to become more and more close to each other as time goes on, and eventually they'll merge in one truth.
And I will say, if you have children that are going to be going off to college and or they've gone to college and they're wondering about their faith that they learned at home and Christianity, this book by Sy Garte, The Works of His Hands. This book would I think would not be a bad place for them to just park for a few hours and read this book. It's not very long, and to see that there are scientists out there that really can do good science and embrace these sort of things, and it doesn't have to shake one's faith when they go to the university. I want to close with something that you read and then give you a chance to share anything about that you would like, Sy.
Okay.
You wrote, "There's a lot we don't know. We don't know if the newer evolutionary theories are correct. We don't know if life originated on some other planet, if the galaxy is full of other Christ worshippers, or if we are all there is. We don't know how much God intervenes in any part of our lives or in his creation. But we do know that we live in a world lovingly created by God, and we are made in his image."
Yeah, we do know that. And we do know that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is the path to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
And right. I think that's what we need.
That's what we need. That's what we need, indeed. Sy, thank you so much for for coming on and joining us. And I think that this is going to be a real help and a strength to many. And I want people to also see that Sy and I don't agree on everything when it comes to evolution, because I look at it a little bit differently, and there's just a lot more that I don't understand. I've never said that these theories are wrong. I've just said, you know, there's a lot that I don't understand. Yet Sy and I agree very strongly on our love for Jesus, that he is the best in every way. And we are on the same side of this thing. And within the realm of science, I mean, it's not unusual for scientists to have big disagreements about things, because we know that science is evolving, in the sense that we're learning from this, and it's changing all the time, and we get new pieces of information, we develop new tools which give us new insight, and we go, whoa, so I wasn't quite right on that. You know, this goes by such and such a mechanism. And we're supposed to try to keep an openness and an open mind on these things. But that we know, exactly what Sy said, God does love us. We've been made in his image. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He lived on this earth, and he gave himself for us. He was put in a grave, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead, and he lives forevermore to make intercession on our behalf. Thanks again, Sy, and God bless you.
Thank you, and God bless you, Jim.